Finally, Jack Nicholson. He turned 89 this week. Nicholson, a three-time Oscar winner, doesn't make many public appearances these days.
And man, he might be the best of all time.
Yeah.
There is a particular kind of celebrity that doesn't just fill a screen. It colonizes your imagination. The kind where, even when the credits roll and the lights come up, the person doesn't quite leave. Jack Nicholson was that kind. He was the grin you couldn't shake, the eyes that burned a little too bright, the voice that could whisper menace or roar comedy, and somehow do both at once. From the late 1960s through the first decade of the 2000s, he was the gravitational center of American cinema. 3 Academy Awards, 12 nominations, roles so iconic they've become part of the cultural furniture of the 20th century. And then he was gone. No retirement announcement, no farewell tour, no press conference where he thanked the industry and wished everyone well. Just a slow fade, a closing gate on a hill in Los Angeles, and 15 years of silence that the world has been trying to decode ever since. In February of 2025, he surfaced briefly, 5 words, a beret, a room full of people who couldn't believe what they were seeing. And what that moment revealed, for those paying close enough attention, was not a comeback. It was a closing statement from a man who had already made his peace. To understand why Jack Nicholson disappeared, you have to go back to where he came from. And where he came from was a lie. He arrived on April 22, 1937, in New York City, though his family's roots were in Neptune, New Jersey, a modest shore town where gossip traveled fast and scandal traveled faster. His biological mother, June Nicholson, was a teenager when she became pregnant, unmarried, and in a situation that, by the social standards of that era, carried enormous stigma. The father of the child was already married to someone else. So June did what desperate families in desperate circumstances sometimes do. She handed the problem to her own mother to solve. Ethel May Nicholson, June's mother, registered herself as the child's mother on his birth records. June was reclassified as his older sister, the boy who would one day play the most terrifying characters in American film history grew up believing that his grandmother was his mother and that his biological mother was his sibling. The household was quiet about its secrets the way old houses are quiet about their foundations. You live on top of it without ever knowing what's underneath. The man Jack believed to be his father was John Joseph Nicholson, who was in truth his grandfather. He dressed department store windows for a living. Ethel May cut hair. Neither of them had been raised by their own biological parents in entirely stable circumstances either, and there was a quality to that household, something absorbed rather than spoken, of people making do with the pieces they'd been given. Jack grew up inside that atmosphere. It shaped him in ways he wouldn't fully understand for decades. He was 37 years old, already famous, already celebrated, when a researcher from Time magazine called to tell him what had always been true. The woman he'd mourned as his mother was his grandmother. The woman he'd grown up calling his sister was the woman who had given birth to him. By the time the truth arrived, June had been dead for 11 years, taken by cancer in 1963. Ethel May had died in 1970. There was no one left to ask why, no explanation to receive, just a fact that landed in the middle of a life already built and offered no place to put itself. Nicholson would later describe the revelation as dramatic, but not psychologically shattering. He'd already formed himself by then, he said, and there was nothing left to destabilize. But watch what he built with that self, and a different picture emerges. He never married. He fathered children with several women, but kept himself at a careful remove from permanent domestic entanglement. He cultivated wildness as a kind of armor, ensuring the world always saw exactly as much of him as he chose to show, and never more. The boy who had been raised inside of fiction became a man who was never entirely off script. That was always his genius. And eventually, it became his exit strategy. The myth of Jack Nicholson is so thoroughly formed around his stardom that it's easy to forget how long the road to it actually was. He didn't arrive in Hollywood and immediately conquer it. He arrived young, eager, and almost invisible, and spent the better part of a decade being precisely that. His first connection to the entertainment industry wasn't even acting. He was a teenager running errands at MGM's animation department, carrying mail, fetching coffee, watching the machinery of show business from the outermost edge. Someone offered him a proper job as an animator, a real position with a future. He turned it down because the pay was worse than what he was already making. Shortly afterward, the whole department shut down. It was the kind of near miss that could have sent him home to New Jersey. Instead, it pushed him toward the stage. He found his way to the Players Ring Theater in Los Angeles, where a former actor named Jeff Corey had reinvented himself as a teacher after being blacklisted during the McCarthy era. Corey ran his classroom with a philosophy that would stay with Nicholson permanently. Acting wasn't the performance of emotion, it was the absorption of life. You didn't pretend to feel things. You felt things, and the camera caught what was real. The lesson sounds simple. Almost no one actually masters it. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Nicholson appeared in a string of low-budget films that went largely nowhere. He was good. He was hungry. He was also not getting the parts that mattered. Out of necessity, he began writing screenplays, not because he'd abandoned acting, but because writing gave him something to do while he waited for the world to notice him. He co-wrote the script for The Trip in 1967 and worked on Head in 1968. He was learning the industry from the inside out, building fluency in a language he'd eventually speak more eloquently than almost anyone alive. The break came not from talent or preparation, though he had both in abundance, but from someone else's disaster. A violent dispute between actor Rip Torn and director Dennis Hopper during the production of Easy Rider left a role suddenly vacant. Nicholson was offered the part of George Hanson, a small-town lawyer who joins two motorcycle drifters on their journey through an America that doesn't know what to do with them. He was 32 years old. He had been waiting for this moment for 12 years. He didn't waste it. Easy Rider became a cultural flashpoint in 1969. A generation of young Americans saw themselves in it, and they saw Jack Nicholson in it too, loose, funny, alive in a way that most Hollywood actors of that era had carefully trained themselves not to be. His first Oscar nomination followed, and then the avalanche began. To list Jack Nicholson's great performances is to construct a kind of autobiography of American anxiety. He didn't play characters so much as he excavated them, found what was raging or grieving or desperately funny underneath the surface, and pulled it into the light. 5 Easy Pieces in 1970 gave audiences Robert Arocha Dupuy, a classical piano prodigy who has fled his own talent to work in oil fields, a man suffocating inside the distance between what he was supposed to be and what he'd become. The performance was precise and aching and not remotely comfortable to watch. Nicholson made you feel the weight of a wasted gift without asking for your sympathy. Chinatown in 1970 forecast him as Jake Sheet, a private detective who thinks he understands how the world works and discovers, too late, that he doesn't understand anything. Director Roman Polanski and screenwriter Robert Towne built one of the great American noirs around Nicholson's ability to project intelligence while concealing vulnerability. He was perfect in it, which is a word that gets overused in film criticism and almost never means what it's supposed to. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest arrived in 1975 and brought him his first Academy Award. Randall Patrick McMurphy, the con man who fakes insanity to escape a prison work detail and ends up destroying himself trying to free the people around him, remains one of the defining screen performances of the 20th century. The film swept all 5 major categories at the Oscars, an achievement that has happened only twice in the history of the Academy, and Nicholson was its engine. The Shining in 1980, Terms of Endearment in 1983, which brought him his second Oscar for a supporting role so vivid it overshadowed leads. Batman in 1989, where he played the Joker with such anarchic glee that he reportedly negotiated a back-end profit deal that earned him somewhere between $60 and $90 million. A Few Good Men in 1992, As Good as It Gets in 1997, where he played a racist, obsessive-compulsive novelist stumbling towards something resembling grace, a performance that gave him his 3rd Oscar and cemented his status as the only actor of his generation to hold that many. By the time the millennium turned, Jack Nicholson wasn't competing with other actors. He was competing with his own legend, and that, as it turned out, was a competition he couldn't win forever. The videos that cover Jack Nicholson's disappearance tend to focus almost exclusively on his health. That's understandable. Health is concrete, medical diagnoses have names, and the internet prefers its explanations tidy. But the story of why Nicholson withdrew from the world is as much emotional as it is physical, and the emotional thread runs straight through the relationships that defined and eventually exhausted his private life. He and Angelica Houston were together for 17 years. By Hollywood standards, that is practically a geological epic. She was the daughter of director John Huston, a model and actress of striking presence, and their relationship was one of those pairing that seemed to generate its own mythology, tumultuous, passionate, and conducted in full view of an industry that watched it like theater. It ended over dinner when Nicholson told her that another woman was going to have his child. Houston received the information and made her decision immediately. There was room for one woman, she told him, and she was going to remove herself from the picture. One conversation ended 17 years. The woman who would have the child was Rebecca Broussard, who gave Nicholson 2 children, Lorraine in 1990 and Ray in 1992. That relationship also eventually dissolved, and he spent the early 2000s in a public relationship with actress Lara Flynn Boyle that ended as most of his romantic entanglements did, with Nicholson still alone and the woman moving on. He was never cruel about any of it in public. He was too smart for cruelty and too self-aware to pretend he hadn't caused damage. What he did say, in a 2013 interview with Vanity Fair, one of his last extended conversations with the press, was that the appetite had changed. He said he no longer felt driven to be out there the way he once had. He said the films that interested him were the ones that dealt with genuine emotion and moved audiences in real ways, and that he no longer had the energy to both work and maintain the kind of life he'd always lived. During his final few productions, he told the interviewer, he'd barely left his hotel room at night. That sentence matters. Jack Nicholson, the man who had turned his off-screen life into a performance as thrilling as anything he'd done in front of a camera, the courtside Lakers seats, the famous parties, the sunglasses that became a kind of trademark. That man was exhausted, and when the engine of appetite runs out of fuel, everything built around it goes quiet. His final film was How Do You Know?, a romantic comedy released in December of 2010 that was a significant commercial failure, losing tens of millions of dollars at the box office. He didn't announce a retirement. He simply didn't make another film. And the months became years, and the years became a decade, and the decade kept going. The speculation began almost as soon as the absence became undeniable. In 2013, tabloid reports emerged claiming that Nicholson had stepped back because of memory difficulties, that he could no longer retain lines well enough to work. People close to him disputed the accounts. Sources told journalists at the time that he was still reading scripts, still engaged with material, still considering projects in some form. But consideration never became commitment, and commitment never became production. In 2017, there was a brief moment where it seemed like a return was genuinely possible. He was attached to an American remake of the acclaimed German film Toni Erdmann, a story about a father-daughter relationship, and the odd ways love expresses itself between people who've grown apart. For a man whose own father had been a fiction and whose children had grown up in complicated proximity to his celebrity, the material had obvious personal resonance. The project fell apart. He withdrew from it, the production collapsed, and director James L. Brooks, one of the people who knew Nicholson well enough to speak candidly, confirmed that Nicholson was still regularly reading scripts. The door in his mind hadn't closed. It just wouldn't open. By the early 2020s, reports from people in and around his circle described a life that had contracted significantly. His Mulholland Drive compound, the gated property in the hills above Los Angeles, where he'd lived for decades, had become essentially his entire world. His children, particularly Lorraine and Ray, became his most constant companions and, in practical terms, his primary caretakers. Ray Nicholson has built his own career as an actor. He appeared in the horror sequel Smile 2 in 2024 and has spoken about his father with a combination of love and clear-eyed honesty that suggests a relationship more functional than the tabloids would have anyone believe. He told a reporter that he and his father were very different people, separated by more than half a century of lived experience, but that growing up he had eaten dinner with his father every single night and had learned how to be a human being by watching him. That detail, dinner every night, carries more information about Jack Nicholson's private character than almost anything he ever said publicly. In the spring of 2025, A source close to the family gave a statement to a New York tabloid that may be the most honest and revealing thing anyone connected to Nicholson has ever said about his withdrawal. The source noted that he didn't like being seen in public much anymore, that he'd been spotted at a hotel and was moving with some difficulty, and that the kind of exuberant, extravagant presence he'd projected for decades tends to carry a physical cost that eventually comes due. And then came the sentence that reframes everything. The source said that Jack and the people around him preferred that the world remember him the way he was. That is not the language of a man in crisis. That is the language of an artist making a deliberate choice about how his story ends. Jack Nicholson has spent 15 years curating his own legacy by the simplest possible means: absence. The Joker doesn't age if you never see him again. McMurphy stays vital if the camera never returns to find him diminished. The image endures precisely because nothing has been added to it. On February 16, 2025, NBC broadcast the SNL 50th Anniversary Special, a celebration of 50 years of Saturday Night Live, one of the most durable institutions in American comedy. The audience at 30 Rockefeller Plaza that night was filled with stars, alumni, legends of the show, and of the broader entertainment world. It was the kind of room that has seen everything, the kind of crowd that doesn't shock easily. And then an 87-year-old man in a dark jacket, a beret bearing the New York Yankees logo, and his characteristic tinted glasses leaned forward from his seat in the audience and said 5 words into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, Adam Sandler." The room erupted. Adam Sandler, Nicholson's co-star from the 2003 comedy Anger Management, a film that had brought them together in a very different kind of on-screen pairing than anyone had anticipated, pointed into the crowd and told the audience to give it up for Jack, that Jack had made it out that night, that he loved him. Then Sandler picked up a guitar and delivered a musical tribute to the show's half-century run. For Nicholson, who had not appeared in public since a Los Angeles Lakers game in May of 2023, the appearance registered as a genuine shock. His daughter Lorraine sat beside him. Photographers captured him the following day outside the Carlyle Hotel in New York City, walking with a cane, his face older but recognizably, unmistakably itself. Fans said he looked good. Some noted the physical changes. He was 87 years old, and the distance between that moment and the man who had prowled through the corridors of the Overlook Hotel in 1980 was 45 years of living. There is a specific detail about this appearance that matters and tends to get lost in the broader coverage. Throughout his entire career, Jack Nicholson never hosted Saturday Night Live. He came close several times, and in his rare appearances in the press after his withdrawal, he mentioned that the absence was something he genuinely regretted, that hosting SNL was one of the things he wished he'd done and hadn't. He appeared at the 40th Anniversary Special in 2015, and now he was back for the 50th, not as a performer, not as a host, not as someone with material to deliver, but as a man in a beret who sat in the audience and said 5 words and went home. There's a kind of eloquence in that which doesn't require much interpretation. He didn't come back to reclaim anything. He came to witness a milestone and to honor someone he cared about, and then he returned to his hill above Los Angeles. It was the opposite of a comeback. It was a man making clear, without saying so, that the chapter was closed. Whatever the tabloids speculated about Nicholson's isolation, the people who actually knew him told a different story. Danny DeVito, who has been his friend for more than 50 years, a friendship dating back to the early 1970s, when they were both still becoming who they'd turn out to be, has remained a consistent and grounding presence. In the summer of 2025, around the time of Nicholson's birthday, DeVito told a reporter that he had visited recently and that Jack was doing well. He described the friendship with characteristic warmth. From the very beginning, he said, there was no ice to break. They simply recognized each other. That's a remarkable thing to say about a friendship half a century old, and it reveals something about the private Jack Nicholson that the public image sometimes obscures. Behind the persona, the sunglasses, the grin, the myth, there was a man capable of deep and durable loyalty. The relationships that lasted weren't the romantic ones. They were the ones built on something quieter. Genuine recognition, shared experience, the specific comfort of being known by someone who was around before the fame arrived and after it faded. There is also the matter of a gesture, largely private, that emerged in the terrible weeks of early 2025 when wildfires swept through Pacific Palisades and the surrounding areas of Los Angeles, destroying homes and neighborhoods that had stood for generations. Among those who lost their homes was Angelica Houston, the same woman whose 17-year relationship with Nicholson had ended so abruptly at a dinner table decades before. According to reports, Nicholson offered his Mulholland Drive home to her. The offer was extended quietly. It was never turned into a story by either of them. It simply happened, or was said to have happened, in the way that genuine human decency often does, without an audience and without a press release. The man behind the gates was still paying attention. He had contracted his world, but he hadn't abandoned the people in it. There is no single clean answer to the question of why Jack Nicholson disappeared, and anyone who offers one is simplifying a complicated human life into a headline. The truth, as it usually is with people of genuine depth and complication, is layered. His body changed. He said so himself, years before the withdrawal became total, and the honesty of that admission deserves respect. He was not a man given to self-pity, which makes his acknowledgement of diminished energy and appetite all the more credible. The physical cost of a life lived at that velocity, decades of work, travel, performance, the permanent hypervigilance of fame, is not abstract. It lands eventually in the body, and it landed in his. The work itself stopped compelling him. He was still reading scripts. He never stopped engaging with the material, according to everyone who knew him. But engagement without ignition isn't enough to sustain a career, and the specific fire that had driven him, the hunger to find the role that would burn, the character who would demand everything he had, no longer produced the heat it once had. He wasn't bored by film. He was honest enough to recognize, when he could no longer give it what it required. The industry had also moved around him in ways that may have made the calculation easier. The Hollywood of 2010 was not the Hollywood of 1975. The mid-sized dramatic films that had been the natural habitat of an actor like Nicholson, personal, dark, complicated, built around a central performance rather than a spectacle, had been largely displaced by franchise filmmaking, by digital spectacle, by a commercial logic that had limited patience for the kind of dangerous, improvisational unpredictability he brought to a set. He wasn't the wrong kind of actor. He was a different era's version of the right kind, and the machine had moved on, and the emotional world had contracted too. The people who had known him before, who had been present for the whole arc of it, who carried the full memory of who he was, were fewer. The relationships that had connected him to public life had ended, one by one, in the way relationships do, through breakup, through estrangement, through death. Diane Keaton, one of his closest friends and his co-star in the 2003 film Something's Gotta Give, died in October of 2025, at 79, from pneumonia. Those who remained close to Nicholson were said to be worried about how the loss would affect a man already living inside a diminished circle. But the deepest explanation isn't medical or emotional or industrial. It's aesthetic. Jack Nicholson understood, with the same intelligence that had made him great, that the image is the thing that lasts. The performance is permanent, the legend is fixed, and the only threat to it is the spectacle of its own decline. He chose, with the same deliberateness he had brought to every performance of his career, to let the last thing the world saw of him be the version of himself that deserved to endure. Not a man made fragile by age, but a man who played the Joker, Jack Torrance, R.P. McMurphy, and 100 other characters who burned so bright the screen could barely hold them. He stepped back so the image could stay whole. Jack Nicholson spent his childhood inside a silence he didn't know was a lie. He built his career inside a roar, and now he lives in a silence he chose, which makes it, in the end, the most honest thing about him. There's a version of this story that is sad. An old man, 88 years old, behind a gate on a hill, largely removed from the world that once could not stop talking about him. A life contracted to family, old friends, and the scripts he still reads, but never makes. By one measure, it is loss. But there is another version, and it requires paying attention to what the man himself has actually said and done, rather than what the absence looks like from the outside. He said, years ago, that he no longer needed to be out there. He made a choice, and he has kept it with the same commitment he brought to every role. He appeared when he wanted to appear. 5 words at a celebration he chose to attend, And then he went home. He helped someone he'd once hurt, quietly and without credit. He has dinner with his son. He has an old friend who still visits. He gave American cinema 4 decades of performances that will outlast a century. He gave the world the grin and the axe and the courtside seat and the Joker's purple suit. He gave it everything he had. And then he stopped giving, because the deepest thing he ever understood about performance was that it requires knowing when the scene is over. The gate is closed on Mulholland Drive. The legend is exactly where he left it. And the silence, as anyone who ever watched him work already knows, is the most powerful thing in any room Jack Nicholson has ever occupied.